Thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Film Studies Online discussion. We will be talking about the film Goodbye Solo, a movie that I hadn't seen before. And I am so glad that I had this opportunity to see it, especially informed by the wonderful introduction of my co-moderator who is joining us tonight, Amy Corbin of Muhlenberg College. Hi, Amy.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming.
Well, Amy, thank you for joining us and for suggesting this movie. For those of you who might be new to our discussions, please keep your audio on mute until I call on you, so you can ask your question or make your comment. I will know to call on you because you will use, hopefully, the raise hand function shown by the number 2 on your screen there. And I will answer people or call on people in the order their hands appear to me to be raised. And we usually can get through everybody at least once, so that's what we'll go for. After you ask your question or make your comment, please return to mute, and Amy and or I will discuss your comment or try to respond to your question. In addition, you can use the chat function. Our colleague Jill will be in the chat, and she will send us some messages if there's any really pointed conversation brewing there. But otherwise, you can sort of talk amongst yourselves in there and also introduce yourselves to each other and to us, especially if you're from outside the area. And if you're from really far outside the area, please go to the Where in the World section within the Film Studies Online portion of brynmarfilm.org and let us know where you're from and how you heard about us and how you think we're doing. As you can see from the map there, we've got people joining us from all sorts of great places. So maybe some of those folks are with us tonight, or some new folks are with us tonight. Either way, that'd be great. Let's see. Beyond that, I think we are ready to go. So I see that we have our usual first person up with us, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. David, good evening.
Good evening, Andrew, and good evening, Amy.
Hi.
This was good evening, and thank you. This was an interesting and slightly different type of movie to watch and sit through and ponder. You were drawn in different ways to and from each of the main and secondary characters, and some of your comments ahead of time, Amy, had me thinking. And I'm going to, I guess, open with my couple of quandaries. I'm gonna tell you how I sort of assumed, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on how my takeaways. I think that we are to assume that William did jump. I think we're to assume that William left the money to his grandson, but we don't really know how, and it doesn't seem to become important. I think that Solo decided on the ride back from Blowing Rock that he can and will pass the flight attendant test. There was just a view that came over his face that's where it took me. And we're left to ponder how Solo and his wife could ever work out their relationship with each of them having sort of dug in. The last item for you to ponder, at least for now, did Solo take Alex in an attempt to influence William not to end his life because Solo read the diary? And obviously Alex did not have that impact, but would it have been different if Alex had not insisted on the ice cream cone and had walked all the way up, and would William have changed his mind? So, your opening left us pondering and knowing that we had very few answers at the end and open questions. And I guess I'll let you comment on mine if you choose to. But thank you. This was an interesting study of people.
Well, thanks for those comments, David. I have to say that personally, I would tend to agree with your reading of the events depicted and the events to come that we don't see. But we should really hear what Amy thinks. So, Amy, what are your thoughts in response to David's points?
Well, yes, I also agree with your interpretation, at least about, what William does. In terms of Solo bringing Alex, I think my take on it is that at that point he has decided that there's nothing else he can do, and that the almost, his act of friendship is to do this for William and be the one that takes him there. And but he says, I can't do it without Alex on the return trip. And I think that that points to, this whole film is about, he has this impossible time accepting that a stranger would try to end his life, and he just gets obsessive about stopping this guy. And then I think that moment, he decides, okay, I'm going to do it. But in order to do it, like, Alex is this like weirdly stable, personality in the film. I mean, for a young child, right? She has this sort of comforting effect on Solo. And they have this like wonderful, playful, relationship that I really love. The you don't see that many step parent, step child relationships that are just that natural and warm and affectionate and humorous. So I think she gets something to hang on to on the drive back. And then it's very interesting that she starts quizzing him in the car, which is, of course, just what William had done, a couple days or weeks prior. So it's almost like she's picking up where William left off. So there's a kind of symmetry to it in that way, I think.
Yeah, I really believe him. I really believe Solo when he says that he wants Alex there for the ride back, because do I think that maybe part of him thinks that, knowing how much William thinks of her from reading what he wrote in his journal, does he think maybe that'll have an effect? I think maybe, but I think he's also being completely honest when he says that he's going to need the security blanket, the stability, the comfort that she provides on the way back, because he knows he's almost, I don't know if he's entirely resigned to what William's going to do, but if he's not, he's darn close. And he knows he's going to be hurting on the way back. And Alex will help him keep it together, and Alex will help distract him, and Alex will comfort him, as she appeared to when he would get home from a long shift, right? I mean, he made it, as Amy said, their relationship was one that we would hope for, and we often see with parents and children, but not, unfortunately, as often with step parents and stepchildren. And I mean, when he makes a beeline to her early in the movie, he comes home after a shift, he makes a beeline to her room to check in on her and talk to her. That I found that curious, but telling about how the characterizations for the rest of the movie would go. It was telling about their relationship, but it was also telling about his relationship with his wife. I think that is just one of the sort of interesting traits of this film that helps set it apart. Let's see, Joss, you have the next question or comment.
Yes. Hi. First, thank you, Amy, for recommending this film. I was not familiar with this filmmaker's work, and I was really awed by how much you could do with so little, which is a real credit to the filmmaker and everybody who participated in it. The other thing that struck me was there was so much open-ended stuff and things that were not fully explained. And you did discuss that in your intro. David mentioned it, and Andrew, you and I have had some interchanges about that as well for other films. And I just wonder, how much certainty is there about what William did at the end? Is there an alternate interpretation of what happened there? And I wondered about whether or not that place, Rolling Rock, had some magic to it. As I remember it, the last shot was Solo tossing a stick to see if it would come back. And then it blacked out at that point, and we don't know. although we had previously seen leaves blowing upwards and we heard about snow blowing upwards, we don't really know. And just putting all that together, I just wonder about the magic of that place and whether or not there could be some other interpretation. Anyway, thanks again for recommending this film, and I look forward to seeing its filmmakers work some more.
Well, thanks very much for that, Joss. And I would encourage people, we don't currently have any hands up, and I don't know if folks are shy or they're not sure, sort of how to approach the film, but I would encourage you to jump in so we can keep the discussion going. But what I would say is, Joss, I think you might be misremembering the movie a little bit if my memory serves. What you said, what you described as the end does occur, but it's not the end. The end is Solo and Alex in the car, and we see the car at a distance on a curvy portion of the highway, and it disappears behind some hills on a curve, and then we're sort of left with the landscape and some wispy clouds, and I believe that's the last shot. I think what you described to me is an ending I could have envisioned for this film if it were made by another filmmaker or if it were remade by a studio. But I don't think it goes with the tone of the film. And as to your question about certainty and uncertainty, let's leave that to Amy.
I mean, it's true, you don't see anything. You don't see any evidence of, whether or not William jumped. You were talking a little bit about, a sense almost of magic, or, is there something sort of otherworldly happening? I mean, I do think Bharani hints at that a little bit through the filmmaking in some of those shots. And initially when we saw some of the fog, we actually got a few musical tones, a few musical notes that don't, for the bulk of the film. In fact, I can't remember the beginning. I should have checked on this. But pretty much the entire film has no soundtrack music. And so the music that we hear is music that the characters are hearing, right? Listening to the radio usually. But anyway, I was struck in those very last shots that of the fog that you do have it's just this tiny bit of non-natural sound, or what we would call non-diegetic sound in fancy film studies language. And so, yeah, I think he's toying with the idea that there's something a little mysterious. But I don't really see anything else that would lead us on that interpretive path. I don't see any other evidence that he wouldn't have done it. He seems completely committed to it the entire time. Solo leaves, I think, assuming that he has done it. So my take on it is that yes, that is what happened. So since a couple of people have talked about open-endedness, I did want to address that a little bit. And I did say that in my talk a little bit about the relationship between narrative structure in this film and Italian neorealism, but it just seems like a good time to bring that back, because we have, not only this ending that, leads us to speculate and wonder because we get no definitive ending, but we also are dropped into, a sort of story, in the middle of it, in a sense, right? So the very first thing you hear is Solo and William talking in the taxi cab, and then you get and I think it's on a black screen for just a moment, and then you actually see them talking, and you can tell that William has ridden in his cab a couple times before that, and so you just sort of are thrown into a budding relationship, and you have no real idea how many rides they've taken together or anything. But this is very neorealist because it gives you a sense of, life is this continuous flow, and a film sort of chops off a chunk here and here, and sort of, takes that out of this continuous flow of reality. But I think neorealist screenwriting and sort of storytelling form tries to, as much as possible, remind you that something happened before the film started and something is going to happen after the film's, ends. And just like in real life, it's the future and we don't know. And so I think it's trying to mimic that open-endedness, is trying to mimic the way, you know, that we live our real lives in a flow, and not, we don't have a beginning, middle, and end, you know, with a sort of climax and resolution.
Yeah.
On the other hand, so
I'm really reluctant to believe that anything but the end he stated he intended is what William met. I can't help but recall that, you know, Alex throws a couple sticks. We don't see those come back up. We don't see what Solo throws come back up. So that doesn't seem very encouraging for anything other than William's intended goal. But, you know, I think this movie has, you know, I enjoy a well thought out movie, a well written movie, and this was certainly that. But I personally also really enjoy when I see an opportunity for a pitfall or a trap a film can fall into and it doesn't fall into it. And I think they're very careful here not to fall into some of those. Not that those would necessarily make the movie bad, but they would make the movie different than what it appears was intended. Mark, you have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I'm curious, what's a moment you saw as like a pitfall?
Well, like I think if we saw everything that they threw come back up, then that would provide a sense of hope and optimism that maybe William is going to somehow, you know, it would have been this clear moment of magic or sort of kind of extra diegetic hope that is nowhere else in the movie. And I could understand the temptation, but to me, it really would have been a false note.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mark, you had a question or comment.
So when I first saw Solo arrive at William's motel room, I assumed he'd been thrown out by his wife. But then later, something that Alex says about hoping that he'll come back indicates that that wasn't the case. So it seemed to me that he went to live with William in the hopes that he could somehow persuade him not to kill himself. And on a second point, sort of related to what you're previously discussing, I think the idea that from blowing rock, things go up, it's kind of in some mystical way, he's going up to heaven. I mean, if you want to add some mysticism at all to that plot point. But am I right in terms of, is Solo intentionally joining William and leaving his family in order to try to save him?
I think he intentionally left. I think he left because he felt he and his wife were at an impasse about his career plans, and he felt no support from her. I sort of view this kind of like the way I explained bringing Alex at the end, which was, I think it's for another purpose, but if it has that knock-on effect, he will gladly accept it. But you know, that's just my interpretation. Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a quick moment where you see him sleeping on the sofa in the apartment, or no, in the house that he shares with Kiera. And so, you know, I think he was already like exiled from their bedroom. And so I suppose he could have kept sleeping on the sofa, but I think there seemed to be a breaking point with him, right? Where her expectations of him were just starting to feel so constraining that he had to get out. And, you know, in a weird way, he treats William as this sort of like bachelor friend, right? He like jokes about women, and, you know, they go drinking together and, you know, talk about music and stay up late. And, you know, so it's kind of like he's got his sort of guy best friend, or he's trying to put William in that position. And so I think when things are going wrong with Kiera, then, you know, there's multiple, like Andrew said, I think multiple things are going on, you know, like he is obsessively, you know, trying to stop William. And so there's definitely a reason for him to go there. But it may also be that I feel like he gets something out of the relationship, as cranky and cantankerous as William is, and I mean, insulting, certainly at moments in the beginning, he still seems to get something out of the relationship, which is a bit puzzling. And I don't know if any of the hands up are about that, but I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts about, what you think of this relationship where, he's trying to save someone's life, but he's continually told to butt out, and sort of what compels him to continue doing that. So anyway, those are a couple of thoughts.
Well, as someone who has been called cranky and cantankerous and far, far worse, I have some evidence, primarily this, that there is some value in having a relationship with such people, but I also know for a fact it can be very trying. And it does make you wonder, as you say, why this person, why of all the people? And that's part of that neorealist thing, right? There have been lots of people in his cab before, there'll be lots of people in his cab after, but this is the one we're seeing. And that's the story that we're being told. Stephen, you have a question or comment?
Hi, yes. Well, two comments. One is that I would be surprised if things were explained at the end, because this movie is full of things that are not explained. He picks up that guy when he has William in the cab, and the guy comes running back and has to be, he's being chased by a mob, and they don't explain that at all. And there's a series of events that happen without any explanation. So I think you just have to take things either at face value or know that they're not trying to tell you what happened. And the second thing that struck me is the very hardworking poor that are doing their jobs, and they're also helping other people, and they're not like complaining about it. And part of this question of why Solo has can't understand William, I think is part, or at least I bring to it, that he just can't understand. He's struggling, he's doing everything that he can just to get by, but this guy wants to end his life. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, there are similarities between the worlds these two men have occupied in their lives thus far, but there are also certainly a number of differences. And I think you touched on an interesting one, which is something I always find interesting about watching films from other parts of the world, or films about characters from other parts of the world, which is the different view on a situation that might be familiar. It's one of the great strengths of movies, and one of the great strengths of a filmmaker with a different view of the world and an open mind and confidence in his audience to bring those things together. Amy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by Solo's complete optimism, that with the exception of a few moments, there's sort of nothing that gets him down. And that verges on a sort of immigrant cliche, right? Of this sort of, the super hardworking immigrant who really believes in America. And I think it's so impressive. This is like another sort of pitfall I think that Bharani avoids, is that, this is not an America where all dreams come true, as evidenced by the fact that Solo, was so positive that he had aced his flight attendant exam, and he doesn't. And, so not letting Bharani, from the point of view of the director, not letting his character achieve his goal, but then having his character still at the end kind of renew his, vigor in terms of studying. I think it's a really different way to show the immigrant experience that, feels like it strikes a balance between the sort of, the real motivations of immigrants coming and wanting to work their way up, colliding with the obstacles that they encounter. And that's something that is in all three of his first films. So I kind of talked about the films as a trilogy, and they're all in different ways about this idea, this immigrant experience and this, these multicultural settings where people are doing what they have to do to get by, and sometimes they help each other and sometimes they don't. But nobody gets a happy ending. Nobody gets a sort of rags to riches kind of story. And so that's, I think, really distinctive about Bharani.
Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi there. Okay, so I'm going to go a different direction, but maybe double back to where we started. I don't know. I thought this movie was absolutely magnificent, and it stunned me. And I'm going to tell you where it stunned me and why. And because I have a kind of a different take from what I've been hearing. I was moving along joyfully with what I thought was sort of another interesting buddy movie, sort of travel on the road, and African guy was going to save white guy, and there's going to be some sort of, well, I didn't expect a happy ending because Amy, you sort of set us up for that. However, I do think there was a happy ending here, and here's my take on this. I think this is Solo's story, and I think there's no coincidence that his name is Solo, nor is there a coincidence that the name of the movie is Goodbye Solo, because I think that while we're sort of discussing and debating whether William jumps or doesn't jump or whatever, that's really a lot less important than what does happen to Solo in this movie. And when Solo read the diary, which was mentioned at the very beginning, to me, that was extremely pivotal, because what I thought was happening in that moment is that all along, Solo is trying to help William from jumping. And at that moment, Solo realizes that William has been paying attention to him, paying attention to his relationship with his daughter and the curtains, paying attention to how hard he was studying. And suddenly Solo was validated. And I think all of this effort that Solo is making with William and perhaps other people that he's met in his cab is for validation, also with his family. And for the first time, somebody really appreciated him. And while Solo wasn't going to save him from killing himself, he was making a connection with another human being that Solo was realizing was important to both of them. So I think that after he saw that, my heart went when he read aloud what he read in the diary, and I saw a change in the character at that point. I thought at that point he realized, yes, I will allow this guy to do what he needs to do. I'm going to take my daughter with me because connection is everything, and I want her with me when I have to come back. It gave me a feeling of hopefulness with what he may work out with his wife, because I think finally Solo is not going to be Solo so much. He realizes that you can make connections with other human beings, and he has succeeded in it, even though maybe he didn't succeed in it the way he had hoped. And to me, that was the utter beauty of this movie, the human connection that these two men made with each other, which was quite unexpected. I mean, that's not what I thought was going to happen. Not that I knew what would happen, but that was just such a pleasure. The grace of Williams appreciating what Solo was doing for him was, to me, the beauty of this film. So there's my take, and take it or leave it.
No, I think that's terrific, Dana. And I really especially appreciate the way you started off, which is reminding us to think about the title of the film and where the story begins and where the story ends. And it begins, in the opening shot, we see both Solo and William, but it's Solo's cab, Solo's in the foreground. And then, of course, at the end, the movie doesn't end when William does whatever he does. It ends on Solo's sort of ongoing interaction, engagement with his daughter. And I also really liked your take on the diary moment, and how I know that you're an actor, and pointing out the change in his performance. I hadn't put my finger on where the change occurred, but I think you're very much right. Looking back on it, that's where it is. Amy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you both just said. So, so I won't repeat that. But one other thing to pick up on in your comment was, that you thought it might be this buddy movie where the African immigrant saves the white guy. And that's another thing I had in mind when Andrew first said the potential pitfalls of this film, right? This film could have gone completely in the direction of what we call the white savior, narrative trope, which is, for those that don't know, it has this sort of buddy kind of dynamic where you've got two people that are really different from each other. But one way they're different is racially, and the Black character or the character of color usually ends up being the one to kind of take care of the white character. And there's a sense in which they want to willingly give up their own life or their own whatever to like help this white character. And it's kind of like, why, what, don't you have your own life? And so it's sort of critiqued, that narrative is critiqued for those reasons, and for sort of continually pushing the Black character of the body to the side, right? And making it really about whatever the problems has. And I think this film does an amazing job of like basically taking a similar story but not turning it into that, even despite the fact that Solo again has this kind of obsessive like dogged determination to stop William. So again, I think it's interesting how convincing Bharani manages to make that. And a lot of it is also, I think, definitely a tribute to the acting performance.
And the other side of that sort of narrative you were talking about is also problematic in its own ways, which is when, the person who is not a member of the group that the story is quote unquote supposedly about. My example I go to is Schindler's List, where all these Jewish people are saved by someone who's not Jewish. I mean, it's based in historical fact, so it's different. But this idea that, this film also could have gone another way, which was William leaves his money to Solo, and that solves all of Solo's problems, which instead of Solo, sort of keeping on being Solo and pursuing what he wants to pursue. So the movie doesn't do that either. The other thing I found really interesting in what Dana said was, you could see this movie being different, where Solo reads William's diary and that makes him redouble his efforts to try and convince him to not end his life. That he sees how the connection he has with everybody and how invested he is, and why would he want to end his life? But instead, the way I took it was Solo saw not that William didn't hear him, not that William wasn't aware of the world going on around him, not that William was in any way, mentally incompetent or ill. It was, he is of sound mind and sharp wit and has made this decision. And in a sense, that's when Solo sort of backs off in a way. So it's a really interesting, way all these things sort of work together to have the course of the story develop the way it does. Liz, you have a question or comment? Okay. Liz, put your hand up again if you have a comment. In the meantime, we'll go to, Liz, are you there? Your sound keeps cutting in and out, Liz. Maybe you could put your question in the chat and we could get to it that way. I'm sorry about that. Emily and Ron, or Emily or Ron, your questions or comment.
Hey, Andrew, it's Ron.
Hi.
A couple of comments. Hey, a couple of comments. One, in addition to the working class solidarity among the immigrants portrayed, I was struck by the harmony across the racial divide. I mean, Solo has brief interactions, with the movie clerk and also the cashier and also the guys and gals who are, administering the flight attendant test. And of course, with William itself, and race doesn't seem to play a role. And this is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which was, a hotbed of segregation not that long ago. Whether that's idealized or not, I just found that so appealing. My second comment is my wife and I at Bryn Mawr pre-pandemic saw a movie by Iranian director Kiarostami, in which a guy is riding around, sometimes in a cab and sometimes in his own car, looking for a place to commit suicide. And I thought we immediately thought of that film watching this one, and wondering if Amy could comment on Bahrani's connection to kind of modern day Iranian cinema. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ron. Is it A Taste of Cherry? Is that the Kiarostami film? I think so. Yeah. It's been a long time since I've seen that. Amy, I don't know if you've seen it any more recently, if you have any, points to make on this.
I can't talk specifically about it because it has been a while, but your plot summary rings true to me. And I think absolutely, there's no question that, Bahrani is of Iranian descent. And he, his parents, he grew up in America in Winston-Salem. So I would hazard a guess that his portrayal of a sort of multicultural immigrant working class life is probably pretty true. Because that's the kind of filmmaker he is. He in New York for his first two films, he went in and lived in the neighborhoods and lived with people that did the similar occupations that his characters were. In Winston-Salem, he may not have had to do that. I don't actually know. I haven't been able to find that much about how he made the film, but since he's from there, he would probably have, certain entries into that community. And I don't know if it's idealized. It is, obviously it is true that racial tensions exist between people, people of color from different backgrounds. But I think what I see running through Irani's first three films is the sense of solidarity. And somebody mentioned that word, I think, and I think that's a really important word to his films, is that in the first three films, you see these people from, different linguistic, religious, racial backgrounds working together, but it's not out of a completely idealized, like we're all human and we all connect to each other. There's elements of that, but it's complicated by economic necessity. And he really just shows that it's just the reality of some of these neighborhoods, that you've got, African Americans working alongside African, taxi cab drivers, and they go to a bar, where a lot of the waitresses are Mexican, and the clientele is multiracial. And I think that's the reality of the types of places he wants to document and the types of stories he wants to tell, which are really centered around work and survival. Solo, Goodbye Solo is sort of the third film, and it's actually the most optimistic ending of the three films. The two films that I hope you will go watch somewhere. I don't know where they're available, but I know Andrew posted in the chat, justwatch.com, so you can go see where you might find Chop Shop and Man Pushcart. But the first one is very bleak. The second one's a little bit less bleak, and Goodbye Soul is a little bit less bleak from there. But they do, I think, strike this balance of we're all human. We can find these human connections, but we're also all surviving. And sometimes we survive better together, and sometimes, people are fighting over scarce resources.
And the other thing I'll say is that, we, out of necessity, we tend to sort of think of history and think of eras and think of regions in sort of these broad brush strokes. And, part of the reason we think that is it's often true. And part of the reason we think that is sort of, that's how that's how we're taught, and that's how we learn, and things like that. But throughout history, there have been communities, whether it's in the American North or the American South, or in the Balkans, or in the United Kingdom, where people of different backgrounds whose sort of public political representatives are not getting along, and in many cases are at war, are themselves able to get along and function quite sanely and even productively in their own sort of communities and enclaves. And I have no trouble believing, particularly for the reasons that Amy mentioned, that this is one such example of that, as they have existed throughout history. Let's see, Diane, you had a, oh yeah, go ahead.
Super quickly, I just realized I think only half answered the Kiarostami part of the comment. So just to confirm, I can't talk in detail about Taste of Cherry, but I know that Barani has said that he's very influenced by Iranian New Wave films, which are in turn influenced by Italian neorealism. So there's a sort of chain of film movements that are talking to each other, and Barani's first film echoes Bicycle Thieves in a lot of ways, one of the iconic films of Italian neorealism. And then I think you're correct to point out the echoes with Taste of Cherry. So I think Barani's taking his influence from both of those places and then combining it with his interest in these urban working class settings. So now,
thanks for tying that back together. Diane, you had a question or comment.
So I thought there was also kind of a comment about American maybe capitalism, where William seems to have enough money that he can spend it pretty freely, and he owns his own apartment and whatever, and yet that does not make him happy. He's unable to connect to his son, and his wife left him 30 years ago, and versus Solo, who has these deep family commitments, no matter how difficult that family relationship is. Now, you could say that that's kind of a stereotype of things, but I thought they did that pretty well. And that the money does not make people happy. Because Solo has some other things. I also thought that although we lose William, there's a new son that's born to Solo. So there's kind of this birth that comes along with the death probably of William. But so Solo is going to go on, and he's got a son that he's going to love, and that will be the next generation. And I thought that was put there intentionally. I also thought that the scene where you see William giving his clothes to the man who cleans up the hotel was also maybe an example of the influence that Solo has had on William, because that almost seemed like something William wouldn't normally do. But here he is, giving away clothes to somebody who might definitely did need it. I guess I'll just say one more thing, and that is that I was particularly interested in seeing this film because the woman who took care of my husband for 4 years before he died was from Senegal. And she's moved back to Senegal, and she lives in this big family compound where family relationships are just, again, this sounds cliched, but family relationships are just so important. And I guess I could see her in many of the reactions that Solo had in wanting to save William. And yeah, the whole thing just rang true. I did like the movie a great deal.
Well, thank you for those comments, Diane. I thought those were wonderful observations, and I would agree with them all. And I appreciate especially the reminder about the birth of Solo's son, and how that provides a note of hope and optimism, not just the birth itself, but for what it seems to suggest about the opportunity it provides for reconciliation with his wife, based on what she says in the hospital room. Amy, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I also thought those observations were really perceptive. I had not thought of the that moment you mentioned that that William is giving his clothes to the guy who cleans the motel. And when you said it's something that William doesn't seem like he would normally do, and I thought, yes, you're absolutely right. So I thank you for making that point. That's one I hadn't thought of. But yeah, maybe it is like a tiny, tiny hint that underneath, I mean, and if you couple that with what we learn about William from the diary, that he actually is more interested in people than he appears to be. That maybe there's some sense that he did change a very tiny amount, as it's in terms of character arcs, it would be a pretty small change, but yeah, I like that.
Robert, you had a question or comment.
There are a couple
Robert?
things in the chat from Robert, I think, so
Yeah.
we talk about those.
Robert? There
Yes.
you go. Go
Oh,
ahead.
thank you. Yeah. I thought it was a very rich film, and I guess my thoughts were a couple of things. First of all, a lot of the whole film could have been made without having a multicultural cast, an African guy and a Latina woman and a white guy. And so I asked myself, why was it so important for Bahrani to make this into a multicultural film when the same thing could have been done without that? The same thing could have been accomplished, the theme. And then I thought, well, I guess my first thoughts was, it seemed like this poor guy, this Solo guy, he's such a nice guy and speaks English beautifully. I mean, unbelievably well for somebody who wasn't born here. But yet, being an immigrant, look what he goes through. I mean, he gets smacked. He gets kicked out of his house by his wife, and then he gets smacked in the face by William, and then his friend Momadou, he gets into a fight with him, and he gets smacked in the face again. And then he tries to connect with William and is utterly unable to affect a change in William, And I'm thinking to myself, is this kind of the vision that Bahrani wants us to see, is sort of like how utterly impossible it is for immigrants in this country and what they face, the incredible obstacles that they face here when they come, And then I thought to myself, I read a review by somebody who did not like the film, and the critic said, I don't like the film because Solo is just too good to be true. There's just no one that was such a beautiful character. He never gets angry. And then the second thought I had was that he was sort of reminded me of a Jesus figure. That he never lost his love for all, never once, in spite of all this adversity that he was going through with his career, and but he was still loving. And anyway, those are just some thoughts, and that's all.
Okay. I think that the multicultural aspects of this film are essential to it. I think that for one thing, as Amy mentioned earlier, this was a community that Bahrani had either grown up in or grown up near and observing. So so the community exists. But I think perhaps more importantly is that different cultures have different, as people have been saying in the chat, different, family organizations and different priorities and different, views of the world and things like this. And I think that, true, those different views can exist within people of the same sort of, race or nationality or what have you, but it's more interesting when those points of view have what I would say is a more interesting sort of, source of, source or point of origin. The other thing I would say is that I feel like Solo experiences the hardships he experiences not really having to do with his status as an immigrant. I think a number of those instances you mentioned are situations where, I would have gotten punched in the face. If I was a guy like William, if I kept pushing him and trying to horn in on his business, I mean, when he's made it abundantly clear he's not at all interested, I would get hit, or I try to take away a fare and $1,000 from a coworker. We're a pretty polite bunch at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, but there's a few there who, if I try to take $1,000 from them, I don't know. So I feel like, I feel like that's not the story Barani's telling. I don't think he's trying to say it's all, the world is his oyster automatically necessarily, but I don't know that we're meant to think that all of those hardships are expressly tied to his being an immigrant to this country. Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I keep asking myself, why did he fail the flight attendant's exam? He seems like a dream flight attendant, right? Like totally friendly, speaks so many languages. And so, and so I come back to, the times he's studying and William's helping him with vocabulary. And, so I think, maybe one aspect of his life that is influenced by his immigration status is language, right? And that may be the reason why he doesn't pass the exam. I don't know. I was going to say one other thing. Oh, yeah. So the critique that he's too good to be true, that is one that I wrestle with. If there was one critique I would entertain about the film, it would be that. And, to compare him to a Jesus figure does really take us back to that white savior trope, because it often has to do with a character who is a character of color, usually Black, who is so saintly that they'll sort of take anything, right? And sort of, the turn the other cheek that people are putting in the chat. And, that's in a way, maybe taking away the full dimensionality of a character, right? To have an ordinary person who's like perfect in this way. And so the question then is, are there, through the acting or the screenwriting or the filmmaking, are there ways in which Solo can do these things that could be perceived as saintly, but we still buy it? It's still real. And I kind of think it is, and I have a few ideas, and we've talked about some of them, his relationship with his daughter and joking about girls with big booties and stuff like that. He's a real guy, and he likes to have fun. And, so he's not a saint in that way necessarily.
Well, and he has his limits, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but he leaves his house when he feels his wife is not being sufficiently supportive, or he feels his wife is sort of reigning, trying to take away his dream. Yeah. And if he were simply, going to only turn the other cheek, he would stay there and fulfill all of his obligations as the husband and stepfather while enduring what he considers to be unreasonable, her hostility, or whatever you want to call it. And so in that regard, he doesn't. I also wonder, we never see the dispatcher, but he sure flirts with her pretty strongly. So, and Robert's right in the chat, we never see him do anything about it, but I don't know, a few of those might have crossed the line. I don't know. So, Yeah, so I sort of side with you on that, Amy, but it is something to think about, and as you say, we see it so often. It's a critique that has to be considered. Janice Antner, you have a question or comment?
Yes, it's very much along the lines of some of what you've been talking about Solo. I mean, I really found him so appealing. The choice of having him be the hero, I felt that he was essentially just a really good person. And it wasn't like it took effort for him to do these things. It was just part of who he was. So he was such a wonderful choice as a hero. And for me, that was refreshing. So often when we're shown a view of an immigrant community, we're shown the scary parts, the things that happen that are violent and so on. And there was not, there were little hints of it in the guy that had to come running away into the cab. But I felt that the choice of him as such a good person was so perfect. Not that he was good in a Jesus-like way, that he would take anything. I mean, he was a normal human being, but he just had this kind of character, as some people do, that he was going to not so much turn the other cheek, but come back and work through the relationship after having had a problem. And I also had noticed, by the way, it was already discussed, but when William gave away his clothes, that I felt that was really very moving. And that particular scene also let me know that no matter what, this is what he was doing. I mean, he didn't need his clothing anymore, and he was going, but yet he was doing something very kind in his going. He was thinking about what was going to happen to other people when he was gone. In this case, someone who was just a peripheral person in his life. So those were the comments I wanted to make.
Well, thank you, Janice. And in particular, I really appreciate your point about, this is a story about a person of good character. Let's not be too quick to try and undermine or marginalize that. I mean, and you're right. I mean, whether it's about whether it's immigrant communities or not, there are so many movies where we're sort of nobody wants every movie to be about a saint, and I don't think this movie is about a saint, but not every movie has to have a protagonist who's just so deeply flawed you kind of feel a little slimy rooting for them to accomplish what they want to. And I there are, it may be hard to remember sometimes, but there are good people in the world. I think most of us would say we know at least one, right? And why can't they have a story told about them once in a while? And I think sometimes critics in particular are sort of forget that too easily. Amy, did you have anything to say in response to Janice's comments?
Yeah, no, it's true that critics can be a bit cynical. But yeah, I wanted to link Janice's comment to a couple that have been in the chat, which not necessarily about the polygamy comments, because I can't really speak to that. But earlier there in the chat, there were several comments about West African culture and being very family oriented. And I feel like, we see that, Andrew was mentioning earlier, just the complete, bond between Solo and Alex to the level that's where he goes to relax when he comes home from work, which instead of hang out with his wife, it's like, but anyway, he's such a family guy. And I think he's truly astonished that somebody could be as alone in the world as William is, right? That he would have, presumably, right, something happened, some rift happened between William and his daughter. That means that the grandson has no idea who he is. And so I think Solo just can't conceive of somebody that wouldn't be connected to their family in some way. And so I think that helps to motivate. That is not just, it is altruism and it is compassion for sure. But he's also just like, he just can't believe that somebody, would be so disconnected.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that that's one of the, one of the sort of things I had in my mind when I was talking about, multiculturalism having a point in this movie, that, that his lack of comprehension of how William could be in that position is very well founded, and it makes far more sense than having someone who sort of grew up in, either Winston-Salem or New Jersey or wherever all their life, who felt that way. That would seem in a way, um, a harder thing to sort of explain. David, did you or Janice have another question or comment?
I did. One of the things that we really haven't talked about tonight that we often do in other places is some of the cinematography. And, about 12 or 13 years ago, Janice and I took a trip to Asheville, North Carolina, and we drove through Boone and some of those other towns that we saw on the map. And I did a 100-mile bike ride early on an October morning, and that fog scene and the way the winds sort of shifted at the top of the cliff were very reminiscent. And Janice made a comment, and she's sitting here, she likes me to talk, like the fall colors that were so gorgeous. Was that film or was that post-production? And just in the cinematography, it really was special by it keeping itself out of the way. We're not overloaded with the cinematography. It just tells the story. And I didn't know if you wanted to comment a little bit on sort of the art of making the cinematography so wonderful, but not really that visible. It doesn't jump at us at all.
Well, thank you for that. There were a number of comments in the chat as well asking us to talk about the cinematography. And I think you're right. It's not a very, those of you who've taken language of film with me, you've heard me talk about this notion of invisible style, which was the sort of Hollywood modus operandi from the 30s, certainly through the 50s. This idea that, the goal was to show the stars and tell the story, and the filmmaker shouldn't be showing off. So, if you saw, if an executive was watching an audience watch a Hollywood movie from 1940 and the audience said, wow, look at that shot, that would have been a mark against the movie, not a mark in favor of the movie in most industry people's eyes at that time. We're obviously long past that, and for a host of reasons, we're looking for or expecting, this very visible style that where we can see the sort of hand of the filmmakers in how we have access to what we're seeing or how we perceive the events. And that happens there on a very, very limited and understated basis in this movie. Now, part of that, to my mind, I don't know this for a fact, but I think part of that is out of necessity. This would have been a very modestly budgeted film, and those sorts of visible camera movements take certain types of equipment, take multiple takes, which translates to time, which translates to money, which is the other reason why I'd be willing to bet that the colorful shots of the foliage at the end are just actually good, honest to goodness, good photography, and not any sort of post-production adjustment. Though I could certainly be proven wrong about that. That would be my sense of it. I think that if you think about, neorealism as Amy talked about it in her introduction, and the connection here, I think the style of the film is one of the ways in which it has one of its stronger connections to neorealism. And I think, since she brought it up so well, I think I'll let Amy talk about that instead of droning on myself. So Amy, take it away.
Well, no, I mean, I think you kind of half answered it already.
Sorry.
Like, no, that's totally fine. I have other stuff to say. It's okay. But yeah, the idea that you're not trying to have the art or the flashiness of the camera distract from these human stories. And, if the narrative style often is very sort of stripped down, like not high drama, it's sort of anecdotal or ordinary. I think a lot of times the camera work is too, but, maybe more in terms of moving camera, but I think there's some amazing compositions that Bharani comes up with. And I just saw somebody posted that a lot of the film shot at night. I'm just so struck by how he shoots these taxi cab scenes, and I mean, having lighting, in a dark car at night, and having it look still realistic is a real challenge. And, there's a couple taxi movies that do this really interestingly, and one would be Taxi Driver, and another would be Collateral, that has some sort of amazing digital imagery that is able to it has this sort of greenish tint. It's a bit similar actually to Goodbye Solo, that, you would think it would look unnatural, but it actually works as a way to illuminate actors' faces in the dark, but still make it look dark. And so, I think that we shouldn't overlook, the technical accomplishment of that. And it figures artistically too, because we spend so much time looking at Solo's face, so we have a lot of these really intimate close-ups, and the car is a space that's intimate, right? So it lends itself to these close-ups because we know the characters are also very close to each other. He uses the rear view mirror pretty effectively, I think. There's certain shots of Solo looking back. One that strikes me is when Solo is looking at the airplane and we get the windshield, and it's like kind of dirty, so there's like a texture to the image, right? It's not transparent in that way that Hollywood does usually want, but we get a sense of, this is a kind of dirty, kind of old taxi cab, and our viewpoint is sort of colored with that. And then the other thing I think that's really a distinctive sort of signature shot of Barani's is these amazing long shots, sometimes high angle, looking down on these like empty streets, because a lot of, we're assuming, I guess, that Solo's driving a lot at night. And so, and unlike New York City, like in the other two films, like the night scenes are really busy, but in this film, the night scenes are very quiet. You just see these warehouses and sort of empty industrial districts. But he frames them in such, beautiful ways. And so you have an industrial landscape an urban landscape that is largely industrial, very road-based. There's nothing really inherently scenic about it. And yet he makes it scenic through, I think, really beautiful use of lighting, these high angles that give you a really expansive look on the sort of streets that Solo's driving through. And you see the same kind of thing in Man Pushcart, his first film, where you've got somebody who's a pushcart vendor in Manhattan. So you've got all these bright lights at night. And there's some shots where the pushcart vendor is just lost in this, the camera's so far back that you almost lose him in the landscape. And I think that's the urban landscape, right? And that's part of the point. So it's different, in Winston-Salem, right? Because it's not so sort of compact and dense as Manhattan. But he still, I think, shows an interest in place, and sort of can make any place look beautiful. And I think that relates to his interest in the working class, right? That he sees beauty in these lives that a lot of people might think are not at all glamorous. Yeah, I mean, they're not the attractive parts of Winston-Salem, right? But the framing and the composition and the lighting is so remarkable. And I know somebody said something about the fog. And yeah, those shots, those landscape shots, the natural landscape shots at the end, with the fog. And again, we have a really effective use of the camera being quite far away and the car driving sort of around that curve, like Andrew was describing, and then it disappears. And the shot holds on an empty landscape, meaning our characters aren't in it anymore, but it holds on it for just a couple seconds. And that's very neorealist also, right? That's sort of that interest in place, that even if a character leaves this, the main character might leave the frame, the camera might stay for a minute because it's important to observe the environment. And Barani certainly is, I mentioned in my intro that he basically sort of, his stories come from places. So he's very sensitive, I think, to the way a location, is dynamic and human, even if it looks maybe ugly, to some outsider. There's all this dynamism and interaction and humanity that's happening in it. And I think when he toggles between these extreme long shots to show you this urban landscape and then these close-ups, then you really get that humanity, but you also get that sense of place.
And I think one of the great, sort of, I hesitate to say trick, but I say most effective choices of this relatively understated cinematography is the contrast between, all the footage we see of Winston-Salem for the first, 3/4 or whatever of the film, and then the landscapes at the end, right? Both the difference in what the camera is filming, but also a difference in scale and scope and distance and composition and things like that. None of the shots in the city and none of the shots really at the park or at Blowing Rock are individually in isolation so spectacular, but that contrast is such a powerful tool that the film uses as well, that that really jumped out at me, that having the sort of the discipline and the foresight to shoot the portions in the city, within a sort of set of parameters, and then sort of, having the confidence and the vision to let those go at the end, for at least portions of the end. It was a really effective choice in terms of the visual communication or visual impact of the film. And our last comment or question, Stephen had another thought. Stephen.
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk about the scene when he's stepping out on the rock. It just seemed to me to be very long, and I don't know if it's because I have extreme fear of heights and the scene just seemed very long, but it seemed like he was trying to understand, what William was going through, and it also conjured up images of me, like of the poem, the Robert Frost poem of stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, of contemplating, something like that, but pulling back from it when Alex sort of pulls him back out of that scene. So I was just wondering if I'm reading too much into that.
No, I mean, I think it was long, and I think the take or the shot of him trying to get his footing in a relatively safe way was one of, probably one of the longer shots, certainly one of the longer shots without any dialogue in the movie. But I can imagine that he has some ambivalence about, venturing out there for a host of reasons. Perhaps not a fear of height, perhaps being a very valid one, because a lot of people have that fear. But yeah, no, I think it stood out for its length. Amy, what did you think?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly impactful. I mean, I've of course had seen the film before, but when I was rewatching it, I'm like, don't fall, I mean, and I think that's what the long take does, is that it plays that tension out, and it really makes you feel, and also listen, the wind blowing around. It just gives you time to almost imagine what it would be like to be on this rock overlooking, this canyon. I'm gonna say something. Sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought. Long take of the rock. I'll probably come back to it in a minute.
Well, that's okay, Amy. We've covered a lot of ground, and a movie that I feel confident saying, a lot of the folks who joined us tonight, hadn't seen before and might not have seen without your suggestion. And obviously it made an impact because we've had this great discussion. It certainly made an impact on me. I'm so glad to have seen it, and I look forward to seeking out the other movies by Bharani. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, and for your wonderful introduction to help give it some context and to give us a kind of a guide to viewing it. So that was really, really great. We, as many of you know, we have a number of online offerings as part of Film Studies Online. We have a number of our remote classroom Tuesday night seminars coming up. These are a bit more in-depth, more like a traditional class, and have a fee associated with them, but we have a number coming up over the next couple of months on a variety of topics. You can see those on your screen, and of course you can learn more about them and register in the Film Studies Online section at brynmarfilm.org. We also have a bunch of other opportunities to discuss and learn about movies at filmstudiesonline.org or brynmarfilm.org. Mini lessons, great film puzzles, wonderful film viewing lists put together by fellow members of our BMFI community. We also have in Theater 5 a whole bunch of movies that you can only see through the websites of movie theaters like ours. You can learn about those at theater5.org or the Theater 5 section of brynmarfilm.org. And of course, we are open. We are showing movies. We've got some wonderful new movies, current movies, Oscar contenders all. We had a great opening weekend this past weekend, and we look forward to another great weekend of showing movies. Some of these will still be here, but some will have some new ones as well. So you can only buy tickets online, and it is reserved seating to ensure appropriate distance between parties within the theater. So check all of that out at brynmarfilm.org. And if you want to support us as we begin to reopen for business and try to keep things going on the solid footing that we've been working towards all this time, consider making a donation to BMFI. We would greatly appreciate it. And we greatly appreciate all of you joining us tonight, as so many of you do every week. And of course, I'm sure you join me in thanking Amy as well. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining us. It was a real pleasure to have you here. And look forward to our next discussion, which we'll be having next month. So that will be great. Until our next discussion, which will be next week, everybody have a great week and thanks for joining us. Take care.